invite now Chantal Naidoo, who is founder and executive director of Rabia Transitions. I'll bring the panel up. Barbara Buchner, global managing director of CPI. I think Louise Walker, and as you know, it's a slight different gender balance than this panel from the last one. And Louise Walker is head of private capital markets and mobilisation at FCDO, and Jaco, who is CEO of Lightsmith Group and doing a lot on adaptation, as we shall hear. So I'm going to sort of maybe just as a sort of segue from the last panel, come to you, Chantal. You were probably the lead architect of South Africa's Just Energy Transition Plan, I think implementation plan, was it? Or was it investment? It was investment plan, okay, good. So the JETP investment plan. And I know, I mean, you were working in the President's Special Task Force on Climate Finance. Can you say, I mean, based on, what you've heard just now, but also as we think about how these that investment plan can really mobilise private capital in line with this 1.3 trillion over time. What are your insights and recommendations there?
Thanks, Amal-Lee. Can't tell if the mic is on or not. Is it on?
Maybe hold it a little bit
closer.
Yeah.
Okay, now it's on. Well, the previous panel, I really resonated a lot with what Diana said. I think the important thing to question was whether a platform works for everybody. And perhaps in the South African case, it wasn't called a country platform at the time. I think it was the experimentation to respond to a challenge at ESCOM. And the fact that if you've got a heavily embedded fossil fuel country with almost a monolithic energy structure around one institution, how do you shift that when they're also heavily indebted? So in many respects, context mattered a whole lot. And the essential, I think for me, the biggest contribution, it was a very painful experience. I'm not going to lie. It was really difficult all around. And often, to your point as well, which I really appreciate, Diana, was that sometimes we demonize the us and the them. It's the global north and the global south, and we don't understand each other. But I think important to recognize through the JETP process in South Africa, we also realized as a country we didn't understand each other either. The outcomes and the desires that we had were actually very different. Private sector in South Africa is no different from private sector everywhere else, actually. We all want similar things. So my reflections on what was helpful about the JETP is that it allowed a very concentrated and deep discussion between donors and a conversation about what a country needs and what they're able to offer, and understanding what their red lines and difficult points are. And it wasn't so much about the money, right? You can write a check. And I often have said it, we got a check, but we couldn't cash it. So you know how helpful that is. It's not very helpful having a check if you can't cash it. Or you can only cash it on certain terms and conditions. How did that help with the private sector in the country? I think it did allow us to be able to go back and ask them what their contribution would be. That wasn't required from the donor countries at the time, but it did allow us to say that if we're going to move forward, a country needs to also invest in itself. Now, that's okay for a middle-income country like South Africa, but it's not the same for every other country, like the SIDS and the LDCs, as Diana said. You are my new favorite. Sorry, I keep on referring to you. But with that in mind, sometimes the capital is a bit lazy. Domestic capital can be a little bit lazy, and international capital can be a little bit reluctant, and also quite draconian about we want structural reforms at a time when actually enough reforms are on the table, but we're not innovating around different things, like how you package the projects and the different kinds of conversations that actually need to happen nationally. So
no, thank you. And that's really interesting to hear, because I think, South Africa, has a very vibrant private sector, the banks, and I know you worked at Nedbank, which I know a lot of alumni of Nedbank, which have really driven a lot of thinking and investing in climate finance. So it's quite interesting that even where you have a strong domestic private sector, it's still challenging. So, I mean, what more then would you like to see? What more public levers, whether policy or public finance, recognising public finance is becoming increasingly scarce, or international in particular? What would you see as really helping to sort of accelerate and catalyse the domestic private sector in South Africa?
So I'm going to go back to those of you who might be familiar. In 2011, South Africa launched the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producers Program. And one of the magical things about that program is that government had a lot of bilateral exchanges with all of the banks and including lawyers around the table. The conversation really was about what risks, what are the immovable risks that you have, that if these were alleviated, you would open up the channels of finance and flow. And that was really essential. So it sounds not so much finance and not so much policy, but it's actually about relationship. In many respects, it's about actually talking to each other in an open and honest way, recognizing that both parties have absolute red lines, and some of the elements on the negotiating table are nice to haves. So I think what we could do differently, given that, and Harry said it, around the fact that we need systemic change, but how many of us in the room actually understands what that looks like? And how do you package a set of investments for systemic change? In the South African context, we were asking for a few things. We asked for, aside from all the elements that Ivan mentioned on what made the Brazilian package, in terms of flexibility, test me now, prioritization and connectivity, right? With all of those in place, those principles are really sound principles. And I think we lose each other when the connection of what needs to happen is seen as it's only private sector's job to do this and it's public sector's job to do that. That's not actually helpful framing at all. I think the JP for me in South Africa is a little bit of a, I have a little bit of pain and PTSD in terms of what I'm seeing on the implementation. Because the narrative of public and private and the individual lanes that each has to travel in is still the status quo. What public sector needed to have done perhaps differently is tell private sector, we need this to happen, and it's entitled self-interest for all of this to happen, and we're in this together. And we needed to not have separated the justice components. We needed to have found a way of embedding them actually in project structures. If you give private sector innovates, I mean, I think most of us in the room has done private sector stints, but there's an immense amount of intellectual capital in the private sector but you need direction. And you need a sense of what the real impact has to be. So things around the sequencing, how do you construct a portfolio, the fact that you needed elements to be front-loaded. And it's a little bit like if you ask for the private sector, if you ask a kid to go into a sweet shop and you say, choose one, you're not going to choose one, right? You're going to say, I want everything. So with private sector, if you say, well, what incentives do you need? What is this? You're going to ask for absolutely everything because you can. So we have to get to a place where we understand what the actual difficulties on scale up actually is. In my experience so far, even in South Africa, a lot of the corporates are very well informed, as you say, and they're innovating, but it's not visible. And they can't take it to scale. So I think what we could do differently, most are not asking for finance, actually, because there's a lot of unproductive capital sitting in these systems as well. And some are not even asking for policy. They are worried about CBAM. They're worried about localization. They're worried about energy security and jobs and the communities that are going to be eroded. And banks are worried about, mortgage loans in fossil fuel heavy cities and municipalities not being paid. So we have to look at the systemic risk and solve for that, and where that shows up in a private sector balance sheet.
No, thank you. I engaged with you quite a lot around that time, and I think one area that I felt was missing from a lot of that dialogue in the very early days was the partnership between the South African government and the South African private sector. And because the partnership seemed to be between governments, international governments in South Africa, and that element was just not there at the beginning. So I'm going to come on to you, Louise, as you've been leading many different initiatives from on behalf of the FCDO around capital mobilisation. Can you say a little bit more about how those have gone, and and I'll obviously come on to what you see as moving forward and some future steps in that direction.
Sure, thank you very much. So I'll talk about a few things that we're doing, and I would say, all very much in progress. So conversation on MDB reform and really looking at the private sector arms of MDBs and making that capital work harder. So driving innovation and behavior change around things like originate to distribute, so moving assets off of their balance sheets so they can lend more. I think one of the big things that we're doing, and we've been doing for a long time, is working with a really established set of instruments. And that's about not just driving investment into emerging markets and developing economies, but deepening those local markets themselves, which is so important. So BII is a critical part of that. The Private Infrastructure Development Group, Financial Sector Deepening Africa, and then more recently Mobilise, which is really trying to unleash public markets in this space. And I think, two things. What we're seeing from the institutional investors is last summer they came to us and said, we're incentivized to do more in emerging markets and developing economies. We want to diversify our portfolios. We want to invest in high growth economies. Our young savers are telling us, so the people who are going to retire towards the end of this century are telling us this is really, really important to us. And they're wanting as well to invest in climate because they see that the existential threat to the global financial system, if we look beyond 2050, is there. So they are really saying, how do we do this? So we're working with them on research. So this building on the Stern report, the sort of next generation of, what is the cost of inaction and what are the risks. We're working on data, which is incredibly important for pricing risk and the cost of capital when we have very rare concessional finance. So we're doing the best possible job. Innovation in product development, which is very important, and last but not least, regulation. So what is the evidence where we can optimize global regulatory regimes to really make this capital available? And I'll leave you with just on the local capital, deepening local capital market side, a great illustration. So some of us this morning were at a discussion on adaptation and resilience in Africa, and InfraCredit Nigeria was there. And that really got off the ground in Nigeria in 2017, where PIDGE used Garantco, its guarantee arm, to issue guarantees so that local institutional investors, so local pension funds, instead of buying sovereign paper, took a risk to them and said, what about productive assets like climate resilient infrastructure? By the third transaction, they didn't need a guarantee anymore because they understood the market and they understood the risk and they could price. So it's a great example of, you talked about relationship. This is relationships and behavior matter. So it's not 100, sorry for all the highly technical people in the room, but it's not 100% technical piece. We then had FSDAI coming in with a pioneering risk-sharing backstop facility to unlock more local currency financing, particularly in the early stage infrastructure piece. BII invested in a blended finance facility for DRE projects. And then most recently, Mobilise came in and supported InfraCredit's initial listing on Nigeria's OTC exchange, which raised 17 million. So this took place over a period of 8 years. And for me, what it demonstrates is market building, and that's really where we need to go. So yes, transactions are important, funds are important, you know, all projects are important, but the ability to deepen and build local capital markets, I think, is a really critical piece.
Thank you. I think, I mean, that's great. You said actually a lot of things. I mean, I'd love to hear more about this cost of inaction for personal savings. I mean, that sounds like something we all should be very worried about. And your point on market building, I think is excellent, particularly sort of unpacks a bit what this sort of systemic type of collaboration looks like. And I think we do talk a lot about the role of governments in owning country platforms, and I think that's absolutely right. On the other hand, we should recognise that you may have these sort of more investment-led or technology-led type platforms, which actually are more friendly to the private sector, more how we would interact. And I'm going to ask Barbara in a minute about a question around the role of catalytic equity, which is something very, very close to BI's heart. But before I do, Barbara, tomorrow you are going to be launching the seminal climate finance landscape, which Barbara always refers to as a spaghetti diagram, but has become, as I always point out, it's much more like lasagna now, which is great. And you'll be launching the 2025 report tomorrow. So could you give us a few insights into the coming report?
Very happy. Is it working? Yes. Yep. First of all, thanks so much for having me here. It's a great discussion. And yes, those of you who know me know that this is one of my favorite babies of CPI, or Global Landscape of Climate Finance. We have been doing that report and that work for over a decade now, and it's really, for those of you who don't know the report, it's basically bringing together the most comprehensive overview of how finance flows across the whole, let's say, value chain. So really from public and private actors through the types of intermediaries, the types of instruments, and ultimately where it ends up, both in terms of sectors, but also in terms of geographies. We are bringing together as many data sources as we can and really try to really make sure that we provide this most comprehensive overview. And I am going to be positive today also because I've been following Amar for a long time now, and I think we all feel that we need to also very much highlight this as an investment opportunity. This is the growth story, as Amar, I'm sure, will be saying later. So I'm going to give you, drum rolls, the new figure of 2023, where global climate finance for the first time reached $1.9 trillion. That's almost $2 trillion of global, public and private, domestic and international finance. We are really counting everything. This is not like just counting from the global north to the global south, but it's really trying to give you a good comprehensive picture of where we stand today. So we have seen that this record $1.9 trillion in 23, that has been more than a tripling over the last 6 years. And that is something positive that I think we need to highlight. I'm particularly excited also because for the first time, private investment has crossed the $1 trillion. That again is positive. It's been a lot of increases in investments from households into electric vehicles, into energy efficiency, into solar power. So I think this is a positive thing to say. Clean energy continues to remain the dominant sector and the dominant destination, but I think it's also reflecting how deeply this, that the focus on clean energy is now embedded in many local and national economy plans. And I think we see that particularly if you look at investments in India, in Brazil, or South Africa, or in Vietnam. So I think this is a good direction. Obviously, can't be only positive. We do still and continue to see major gaps. I think we see particularly gaps in high-emitting sectors such as agriculture, waste, industry, all the hard-to-abate sectors. They actually are not attracting the finance needed. They're receiving less than 10% of the overall flows only, and certainly need better and stronger policy signals and tailored financial instruments. At the same time, also probably not a surprise, even though these are the 2023 figures, we have seen public finance declining by 8%. And that is, I think, particularly concerning just with the ongoing fiscal pressures and some of the development budget cuts that we have heard already. But I think, so we are concerned about the trend. At the same time, I think it just strengthens again this focus on the quality, on the impact, on better use and more effective use of existing public budget. I think it's particularly important, no surprise here, for emerging economies in developing countries where affordable capital is very hard to access. So. Again, coming to the encouraging signals, again, we do see that international climate finance to these countries has been increasing, and that is a new trend that we are seeing and which we are very happy about. We see that these countries now receive about $200 billion out of the 1.9 are going to emerging markets and developing countries. But much of it is still public, so there needs to be this stronger focus, and there is obviously a lot going on how can we better mobilize private capital, how can we better use existing instruments, like replicate what works, but then also make sure that you continue to think about catalytic instruments. And we've heard already about guarantees, about obviously insurance as well, but also equity that can really de-risk private capital. Just to end, again, very excited about it. Maybe it's already on our website, maybe not. You have to check our website. But you will get much more detail there. But I think the very encouraging trend, which I'd like to finish on, is if the current trend continues, then we would get to $6 trillion by 2028. And that is the lower bound of all the scenarios on what the needs are globally. So that could be a very positive, actually, trajectory. So let me end here.
Okay, thank you. So I was going to ask you a bit about, because I know you're looking at catalytic capital. Maybe I won't sort of ask you about that follow-up question now, but maybe just before I introduce Jay, can you give any insights onto the amount of adaptation finance? Yeah, I was trying to hide that one. But it's very complicated. I think we still don't have the right way to count for adaptation finance, and you have been very active in this system, obviously. We see that actually less than 4% of overall climate finance is going to adaptation. Only it is about $65 billion. I have to, however, again, as there are still so many issues in how you track adaptation, I have to really, this is why I didn't want to actually bring it up immediately, because we have seen most sources, actually both public and private, increasing for adaptation finance, apart from some very prominent development finance institutions, just because of changed methodologies as well. So I think the issue that we still count only the incremental parts of investments as adaptation finance, while we do count for the full amount of mitigation finance, is still an issue. So sometimes I wish we hadn't immediately included it all in the same spaghetti diagram. But yeah, certainly the gap is still big. So even if it's, if there is issues around counting and tracking, I do feel that we certainly need to think about other ways of unlocking capital for adaptation and resilience. And again, you do so much at BII, and having Jay here as well, which, as he knows, is one of my favorite private equity investor in this kind. I think he's going to solve it all, so that's good. Okay, so, well, I think you've been introduced, Jay, but just say, I think, the Craft Fund, which you're going to tell us about, and you're now in your second raise, which is exciting. That was actually one of the kind of initiatives that came out of the Climate Finance Lab, and I remember being at that meeting in New York, actually, when you first proposed it. I think I told you to go and talk to the EIB as well, which you did. So you did? Yeah, so you can thank me. But no, but so Jay, you are probably the first sort of truly 100% adaptation, private equity fund. You have benefited from concessional funding from different sources, so blended finance. So can you tell us a bit about what that journey's been, and then what you think needs to happen moving forward?
Yeah, so I thought I would thank you very much for having me. I'm Jayco, the co-founder and managing director here at the Lightsmith Group, which, as Amal-Lee very kindly mentioned, and thank you, Amal-Lee, for the suggestions and many others in this journey. We did approach the EIB, which is one of our largest investors, and very happy to have them, and the Green Climate Fund, and the Nordic Development Fund, the KfW, a whole range of other folks, including the Rockefeller Foundation and private sector investors as well. We are a product of the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance, and I would wear a bunch of tags explaining all the different blended finance mechanisms that we have been involved with. I wanted to tell you kind of three things, but to start with a very important acknowledgement, which is this is a disaster, right? Climate change is here. It's a humanitarian crisis. It's a tragedy for livelihoods. It's an economic stressor. And before we talk about what a great investment opportunity it is, I want to really acknowledge that, because we would really prefer not to have it as an opportunity at all. So that's the first point that I want to make very clearly. Then very quickly, as Amal-Lee mentioned, the CRAFT Fund, the Climate Resilience and Adaptation Finance and Technology Transfer Facility, which is a mouthful anywhere except for in the climate context, was the first private investment fund for adaptation, period. It's created and got to first close before COVID, and Christmas Eve 2019 was announced at COP that year. Final close took about a year and 2.5 years afterwards to January of 22, and we're now ending the full deployment of that fund here in 2025. And then shockingly, we still are at about a 4 to 5% share of adaptation finance, of climate finance, and the gap is over $300 billion per year, I think, is still the challenge here. So we have had a lot of experience actually mapping out the sector, developing the infrastructure, developing the ecosystem in partnership with BII and a number of other DFIs and ARIC and so on. And so, this has started. It is moving very, very, very slowly. The second thing I wanted to tell you is that the private sector is now beginning to think about this in a serious way. And so I just came from meetings in Singapore where there were dueling reports by Temasek, one of the sovereign wealth funds of Singapore, and GIC, both of which concluded that the investment opportunity for adaptation for private investors is in the $1 to $2 trillion with a T range today. Now, this is something that we have been working on, pushing forward as an estimation and a narrative in the context of making adaptation investable, proving out that it can be investable by the private sector, and then catalyzing capital into it. But the GIC report actually described it as a quote-unquote inevitable opportunity for investment, which follows on what we think is the most persuasive argument right now to the private sector, which is that adaptation and climate resilience investment is a quote-unquote unavoidable opportunity. And what I mean by that is if you look at the IPCC graphs from 2023 to 2030 and to 2040, there's extremely little variation in the range of possible global warming outcomes. For the next 5 to 15 years, the trajectory is basically fixed. There's a modest amount we could bend the curve from 2030 to 2040. We're likely to bend it in the other direction now. And so I would argue as an investor, you have more certainty right now about the trajectory, direction, and impact of climate change than you do about inflation, interest rates, tariffs, like who knows what day it is, geopolitics, the direction of consumer behavior, the direction of artificial intelligence, who Taylor Swift will be dating. So in 2030 or 2040, if we're having this conversation, I have no idea what those outcomes will be, but I have a very, very high conviction that climate change will have continued to happen, and the economic and humanitarian impacts and biological impacts of that will be inevitable. And that's how the IPCC describes it. There are certain changes that are now unavoidable and or irreversible. So that creates an opportunity to make investments around that, and that's what's actually resonating with the private sector. The third thing I'd say is that there are practical ways to attack the adaptation problem right now. The CRAFT Fund, the first private equity, private investment fund for adaptation and climate resilience, and its associated technical assistance facility proved that you can map companies, deploy capital today, several in Brazil, several in India, several in Malaysia, and transfer technologies everywhere around the world. And this is now an investable area that's validated by a number of private sector folks. We are in the process now of developing the first integrated investment platform for adaptation and climate resilience, integrating credit as well as equity and technical assistance into a singular platform that sort of works on the architecture of the original green bank structures for mitigation. That strategy is called SCALE, and that offers the opportunity to replicate some of the capital mobilization success we've had in mitigation. You've heard about the aggregate numbers in adaptation. We can learn from mitigation in adaptation and scale capital rapidly. That will require all of the folks in this room, MDBs, DFIs, civil society, philanthropy, private sector investors, to start to act, to go from a community of thought leadership to investment leadership. And if I could wave a magic wand, I would tell you that by BELM, it is possible to catalyze the existence of that first integrated platform for adaptation and climate resilience in the private sector, but it will require people to actually make decisions to do it. And I'll leave you with this last statement, which is what we really need now, in my view, is something like what I would call a Mitchell Field moment. So there's a lot of discussion in the literature about technology development about the Kitty Hawk moment. In 1903, Kitty Hawk is where the Wright brothers for the first time have powered manned flight. They invent the airplane. And then within a decade, there's like a dozen companies around the world making airplanes. It's not until 1929 at Mitchell Field, Jimmy Doolittle makes the first instruments-only blind airplane flight. He flies entirely blind, using only technology, using only instruments to guide the plane. That means you can fly not just in broad daylight on a fair weather day, but you can fly through storms, you can fly at night, you can fly through turbulence, and it unlocks flight for all kinds of conditions well beyond when it's a plain vanilla, bright sunny day. That is what we need right now, is those technologies, approaches, solutions that will get us through the period of inevitable complexity and turbulence that we have created through climate change. And anyone who has access to those technologies that can fly through storms, fly through turbulence, fly at night, will have a competitive advantage, will have an economic advantage, will have a national security advantage, will have a development advantage, and everyone who is left out of that equation will not. And that is, I think, the inevitable, unavoidable opportunities. What do we do with that knowledge? How do we shape capital now to take advantage of that problem? Because the other thing we're not used to right now in this context is the time frame is now going to compress. The failure to act is not a linear change in the alternative circumstances. Business as usual is not, it is just not going to get solved. Business as usual is things get rapidly worse. And so the faster we act, the better. That's the unavoidable opportunity.
Thank you, Jay. So, I don't know, I feel kind of optimistic, but also disturbed. But I think it definitely reinforces how important it is that we really do work to accelerate that and unlock that unavoidable opportunity. So I'm going to open up for questions, and if there are questions for any of the previous panelists as well. But also, as a first sort of question, not question, but intervention from the floor, delighted to ask Mr. Shah Mirza, who you're Managing Director of Private Power Infrastructure Board and CEO of Alternative Energy Development Board with the Ministry of Energy, Pakistan, to tell us a little bit about some of your ambitions and this transition.
Actually, we were talking about the financing, and of course, that is the key issue which we have been talking last COP 2 or 3 COP, that where the financing will come. So there are, of course, two sources of financing. One is the international and the multilateral, and the other one is the local sources. But in Pakistan experience, I think putting this the policy right and the incentives and the regulatory framework right can help a lot. What we have experienced in Pakistan in the last 3-4 years, we have seen the growth of the solar PV, the rooftop small solar system of 10 kilowatt, 5 kilowatt, 15 kilowatt. They have crossed 6 gigawatt, which is a huge number. This has been financed to somewhat by the central bank scheme. They provide some concessional financing, but that's not a very significant amount. The most of the money is coming from people investing their own and realizing that probably they can get the benefit within 3 to 4 years, the payback period, they can get this benefit. So this is one part which is a grid connected, but along with that, I think another 6-7 gigawatt has been set up, which is not the grid connected. So in the last 3 to 4 years, about 12 gigawatt of solar PV have been added in Pakistan by the private sector without any major international contribution or major international investment. So I think that's very important that the government give the right incentives. Although there are other issues with that, because now we are facing the grid stability issue because of so much solar small system are injecting that. We are addressing to that, but the right policy and right incentive really work. And I think when we talk about the country platform, we should actually look what is the priority. The second thing, I think I was looking this in climate and development finance dialogue. I think if we're talking about what we can get from this climate week in London, so still when I read this, it's climate is different and development is different. So we need to come up with some theme, some name that where actually the climate is the development. Climate is the part of the development. So development and climate are not two separate subjects. Today, the world we are living, actually without climate, there is no development.
Yeah.
We can actually do the development, but that can destroy the climate and probably create further issues instead of creating development.
Yeah.
So we should come up with some better terminology. I don't have anything specific in mind, but we should come up with better technology. You should not segregate between the climate and the development financing. So that's I think.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I think, I mean, I'm a big fan of sustainable development, actually. And, you know, not forgetting in the same year we had the Paris Agreement, we had the SDGs, and also the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which is the 10-year predecessor to the Finance for Development. But, I mean, yeah, I personally prefer sustainable development as a concept. I think because of the 100 billion, we send the 100 billion commitment, we sort of brought out climate finance as a particular concept to be able to track that political commitment is my view. But that's a whole debate, a whole nother panel that we can have. So any other comments or questions? Yes.
One small point.
Okay.
Actually, to some extent, you have answered that, but when we were talking about 4.9 trillion investment in the climate, actually, I think the major question is probably the mitigation side. There, the investment is easier and probably the payback period is less and people are more inclined to make investment. But the adaptation side, I think, is more neglected side where, as you were saying, we need to do more work on the adaptation side because there the investment and the financing is very limited. Thank you.
No, thank you. And thank you. And we actually have an event here tomorrow where the CEO of HBL, the Pakistan Bank, will be here. And actually, we were very happy this year. We did our first line of credit to HBL for climate smart agriculture, which brings adaptation, I think $75 million loan. So, yeah, we'll be talking more about that here tomorrow. And it will be live streamed as well if you've not registered. So then we have two here.
Chavi Meetle from Climate Policy Initiative. Hearing both the panels, we see like coordination is really the answer, right? And it definitely does not mean more actors on the table, but probably more, you know, what the panelist was talking about, country ownership, alignment, and more actually simplification as well. Do we think that with proliferation of all the platforms and initiatives, etc., the system is becoming more fragmented than like, than less? And if so, like, you know, how we can kind of really consolidate this institutional landscape of climate finance? And yeah, exclude my boss from answering that question.
That's great. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Paul Steele from International Institute for Environment and Development. I've got three quick comments. First one is it just seems a great opportunity in Brazil to bring together the three conventions, which started in 1993 from Brazil, but no one seems to be talking about this. You know, we've got biodiversity, we've got climate, and we've got desertification, and environment ministries traipse around the world to all these different meetings, so they can't focus on domestic policy. So bringing this together might be a real opportunity. Secondly, on the domestic mobilisation, we haven't talked about that very much. Most of the money spent is, I mean, Barbara alluded to it, is actually domestic government expenditure. The international is a bit, frankly, a bit of a sideshow compared, even in LDCs like Bangladesh, 75% of the money they spend on climate change is domestic. And then the third point is, if you look, again, the bulk of the money is not by either international or governments, it's actually by households. So we need to understand much more. I mean, you again alluded to this, Barbara, how much households are spending both on mitigation and on adaptation, and look at their own, those household priorities and match international and government spending with those household expenditures? Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I guess there weren't so much questions, but comments there. But I think, I mean, I was really heartened to hear that the figures that Barbara referred to, and also reflected by the situation in Pakistan, where these are mainly households that are purchasing solar panels. I think maybe another question here. We'll take any more, and then we'll close. I'll ask the panelists to respond. So we'll take these two, and then one more over here, and then I'll ask the panelists to respond to any or all of the questions. Oh, thank you, Louise. Sorry, thank you. I know you appreciate you needed to leave. Thank you.
Hi, thanks very much. My name is Nosheen. I'm representing Habitat for Humanity Great Britain. It's an international NGO. Thank you for the conversation today. It's been a brilliant conversation, but it's been very technical so far, and I think I'd like to bring a slightly more human lens to the conversation, if I may, and talk about the impact of climate change on people. And so at Habitat, we see housing as really essential climate and development infrastructure. So we see it not just as shelter or four walls, but we see it more as a foundation for resilience, for health, for economic participation. And yet housing is still underfunded and it's overlooked in climate finance conversations. And given what I've heard today of the increased focus on resilience and adaptation, I'd love to hear how institutions like BII and EBRD are going to think about integrating affordable and climate resilient housing more centrally into their sustainable infrastructure pipelines, especially in informal urban contexts, and especially given the global displacement crisis and the devastating number of humanitarian crises. Thank you.
Clarissa Lena, NDC Partnership. I think one thing that we hear a lot when we engage our developing country members and also public and private partners is that even in a constrained funding scenario, we can't even spend the funding that we have. And so I'm curious whether any of the previous or current panelists have any thoughts about how to build out those project pipelines more effectively. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take one more question here, and then we'll ask the panelists to close so we can invite Amar to make his closing remarks.
This has been a panel with, I think, incredibly strong narratives. One which I think is an incredibly strong narrative for me, which is the protection of personal savings, as someone who probably is going to be saving until the second half of this century. But the other one is the unstoppable advantage of climate adaptation. And I suppose the thing that I'm worried about with that second one is that as we have political leaders that are increasingly inwardly looking, and including Reform UK, one of the things that Richard Tice actually believes in is climate adaptation, surprisingly. So how can we continue to use that narrative to catalyse adaptation finance for low and middle income countries without it being captured by the global north?
Yeah, and thank you. And actually, interesting, I joined the launch of a report by Oxford University, which showed that the UK's food and other security is heavily at threat by climate risks in the developing and emerging markets. So, as we saw last year, the Panama Canal, which, that prevented global trade, I think. So I think there is increasing evidence, and it's a really interesting report that emphasises the need for international support to enable countries to adapt for the safety and security and the economic prosperity, actually, of the UK, which is interesting because I think we always talk about mitigation as a global contribution or global public good, and we always think of adaptation as local, whereas actually it's similarly the benefits can be global. So, so I answered that question on behalf of the panel. And now, I'll start with you, Barbara, Chantal, and then Joe.
Just starting with the domestic part, you're fully right. Again, our figures show that 80% of the 1.9 trillion are being raised and spent in the same country. And you're fully right. I think, obviously, there is a very important part of development banks, not only the multilaterals or the bilaterals, but also the national and subnational, but households and others, I think, extremely important. So I think better understanding how can we unlock even more so. And we've been looking at, for example, at South Africa in more detail, where we again see how important I mean, we have like more than 90% of climate finance in South Africa is coming from the private sector, lots from the local and domestic private sector. So I think you're very right that we have to work even more on that. And again, Amar is also leading lots of the domestic resource mobilization, but I think a very important point. Very quickly on the different initiative and pledges, I'm shamelessly going to make a very quick plug on some work that we are also again doing with HLAG and Amar, which is using the global climate finance framework that got launched at COP28 by UAE as a way to help structure all the different initiatives that are popping up, from carbon markets to G20 to all the items under the UNFCCC. And we have a tool that's called the Compass, where you really can look at what are the goals of all the different initiatives, who is responsive, who needs to be accountable ultimately to take them forward, and again trying to also come up with some clear trackers there. So I would invite everyone who is interested in actually talking to us, because I think it's something that we should make much more useful and like really help others to understand, and also hopefully avoid that we continue to have new pledges and initiatives without actually following through what has been announced over the last years, which is really important.
No, absolutely, yes, and keep track. And Chantal, I don't want to talk because I want to get to Amal. So that wasn't a sort of be brief hint, but.
Sure.
Kind of?
Are you sure?
Yeah, be brief.
So maybe I'll respond to a few. The Habitat for Humanity prompt, and I think thank you for bringing that back into the room, that we are talking about people. And I think one of the things that I see, and I notice there's a lot of just transition related events at London Climate Action Week. And I suppose from a people's perspective, right, to appreciate who is being hurt and where are they being hurt and why are they vulnerable, and what are the elements that you put in place. Because one of the fundamental things I feel that we're missing about making people the priority and the center is that when you're constructing a transition-related portfolio, and we don't need single asset funding, we need portfolios, you actually need to think that you need to throw a social safety net out first to catch the vulnerability. Because if we're not doing that in however we're constructing the portfolios, then we're not getting the justice part of the transition right. We might be getting the technology bits right. And perhaps on the domestic resource mobilization point, the role of national development banks is really, really essential. And I'm a bit biased because I have a passion for the Development Bank of Southern Africa on many levels. And I think to the question about the strong narrative about resilience, right? Infrastructure needs to be resilient. And if infrastructure is resilient, you are creating social cohesion and economic security. And the best placed institutions to do that is actually national or regional development banks. So Amar, for your work on the reform agenda, I think just empowering national and regional development banks is really, really essential. We can't get away from that, because more than anything else, they better understand what's happening on the ground. And if you don't mind, if I can make an antidote to South Africa's 90%, right? Renewable energy. And why? Because it makes money. And I think we also need to appreciate that the domestic resource mobilization has two faces. The one is that what I said up front, that private sector and public sector, whether it's north or south, is still the same. Like, we have the same mandates and we pretty much want the same things. So what changes is maybe some kind of moral, what Leslie was talking about earlier, the moral principles, of what's driving the investment agendas of those places. But also what I saw at the fix was that there was a lot of narrative about domestic resource mobilization. And from a really cynical point of view, that does sound a little bit like those that have to put the money on the table trying to cop out a little bit. I'm being a bit cynical, but what I'm saying is, what does it look like more than anything else? So in all of this, we can't forget that there are obligations and there are real vulnerabilities. And to Diana's point, as much as we want to change the narrative, some of it is really difficult, because if we go back to justice, we are trying to build just climate justice, but there's political injustice, this long history of injustice that you've got to go back on. I stop there.
Thank you. And Yeah, I mean, well, a lot I'd like to respond to, but I will hold my fire.
I'll try to be brief. Then, just very quickly, two responses. One is I think the housing point is really important. I think one of the things the private sector and the global environment can do is supply data and analytics to inform those decisions, right? So Samantha Power, the former head of USAID, reported that after the Pakistan tragic flooding, some of the only buildings that were left standing in many of these places were USAID-funded schools. They were built to U.S. code, U.S. Building material requirements, and they became a source of response for recovery efforts. And if every building had been built like that, maybe there would be a lot more housing that would have survived. And so the data and analytics to inform what the future environment and requirements are going to be is critical to that. You can't build without knowing what you're doing. And so that's a role the private sector can participate in and give the same information to folks in Pakistan as you can get in like Los Angeles, which already destroyed $40 billion worth of some of the most expensive real estate on the planet Earth. To the point about narrative, I would take any narrative that increases the amount of adaptation investing anywhere, because we are fractionally preparing for what is going to be an inevitable disaster and series of disasters. It's the beginning of hurricane season. I don't think it's going to get any better. I don't think it's going to be better in 5 years. I don't think it's going to be better in 15 years. So the question is, how do we scale technology and solutions on the planet as fast as humanly possible, and then creating that mechanism to transfer those technologies as fast as possible to low-income countries, to SIDS, to other developing countries, and so on, to show them it is in their own best interest to deploy those technologies. The CRAFT TA mechanism does that. It transfers technology from developing countries and developed countries into developing countries. It is woefully under-resourced, but it works. So things like that can be these mechanisms that enable us to get there. But we need massively more technology and solutions at scale to solve the multi-trillion-dollar inevitable problem that we've created. So that's what I would suggest.
Okay, thank you. And I'd love to sum up, but I'm really going to restrain myself because we are over time. And I'm delighted that Amar Bhattacharya has agreed to make some closing remarks. So Amar, we've worked together for many years in different contexts, and I think, I'm not sure how many people know, Amal was known as the godfather of sustainable infrastructure when we were working very closely on that agenda. And I think now is really becoming a true leader on this whole discussion around how we scale finance in the context of the 1.3 trillion now under the Baku to Belém roadmap. So thank you, Amal.
Thank you, Amal-Lee. It's because of that I am here. The many years of friendship and work together, but also BII. Have lots of dreams for BII. Going to scale, and E3G. With Rob, I knew him again in a different incarnation, but I've worked very closely with E3G. So special privilege to be here, as standing between me and some drinks out there. I'm going to keep this brief and quite telegraphic. So one way to to kind of pick up what Jay said is the starting point is the investment imperative. I don't call it just opportunity, but the investment imperative. And the investment imperative turns out to be an opportunity. That's the way I would put the framing. Now, there are several areas of investment. I mean, if I had more time, I would put up the 2035 numbers for the roadmap from Baku to Belém. But let me just say that the numbers, more important than the numbers, is the story behind the numbers. And the big areas of investment are the clean energy transition. And I want to underscore something about the clean energy transition that's extremely crucial at this point in time. And that's the revolution that is possible because of solar. We always tend to lump renewables together, but a watt of solar now is 8.5 cents, a kilowatt of solar. That's mind-boggling, okay? But it is not that all over the world. It's just in one country. That same country has a supply capacity of 800 gigs going to go to 1.4 gigs very soon. Total world supply of solar will be about 2 terawatts in 2 years. The tipping point that we are all looking for is staring us in the face. That is the foundation of the clean energy transition. The world has to come up with an international cooperation framework that makes that solar available in the world at large for that price and makes the cost of capital available at the same price it would be if it were built. Because the return on it, as Chantal pointed out, is excellent. It's not a problem. There is no problem with the rate of return. We have to fix the issues that constrain both the pickup, the supply, and the cost of capital. That is a foundation for something else. We will have to invest massively in the grid, but not one central grid. It will be different grids in different places. You know, it depends on the source of energy, depends on the geography, depends on the... I often say to people that if you take Africa and you had energy for 10 hours a day, you can do a lot with that energy. You don't need a huge amount of storage. Think about what could happen to Africa if you had really low-cost energy to drive its development. So that's an opportunity I want to focus on. It's the largest bucket in this. Decarbonization is also an opportunity, but let's face it, decarbonization will have costs because we made mistakes. We put a lot of coal-fired power plants around the world, especially in Asia. We also have to decarbonize the hard-to-abate sectors. More difficult issues, but they are manageable. Second, the word is resilience more than adaptation. We need to build resilience, and actually resilience to shocks in a world where there are more frequent, more intense shocks. But one thing, Jay, that's also very important, the world has 9 billion people. And the interaction between people living in more vulnerable places and vulnerability to shocks is making this a top-line agenda item. As Jay pointed out, and there's an excellent WRI report that has come out, which actually shows that the investment in adaptation and resilience is hugely impactful, huge. Their number is 10.5 times payoff from from a dollar investment. World Bank is about 14. Whatever it is, it's a very large payoff. So adaptation and resilience is big, but for a long time we will be dealing with increasing costs of loss and damage. We didn't talk about that. Who's going to pay for that loss and damage? Yes, we have to have much better insurance systems, but we also need to protect those who will not be able to protect themselves. So there is a big ticket item for loss and damage. Third, we have to be able to invest more in natural capital. The world's natural capital is degrading faster than, it's a hidden crisis. We don't talk about it, but natural capital is degrading. And, if you think again as an economic proposition, if you were to restore the degraded land that we have, I'm not talking about forestry, I'm just talking restore the degraded land that is in developing countries, the productivity boost that would come from it is tremendous, and it would mitigate some of the secular impacts on agriculture. So there's a big natural capital agenda. That's why, at least in the work we do, we tend to bring these together. They are not separate. And indeed, there are so many activities which are mitigation, adaptation, and development rolled up in one. You think about degraded land, it's carbon sequestration. It's hugely impactful on resilience. And, of course, it produces livelihoods for people. So I can give you many, many examples. So the investment imperative and the investment opportunity is the big thing. I want to make one point, which, yes, it's very important to talk about the short-run returns, but the analytical work that we do suggests that if the world moves from a fossil, dependent economy to a fossil fuel-free economy, the payoffs are huge. So if the world is spending right now something like 10 to 15% on fossil fuel consumption, I'm talking about the consumption part. Think of the capital value of that. You put that money into investment for health and education. Forget about climate. the payoff we would get is huge. So we should, yes, we should talk about how we persuade people, but as leaders, you people need to be very, very clear that this world is actually the world. This is the growth story of the 21st century. Now, in my closing, I want to say a few things about breakthroughs. If we look at the agenda, and Ivan pointed out, what might be the breakthroughs that we need to drive a successful roadmap from Baku to Belém, as Rob was suggesting? So I would say, and I'm sure this will be very well laid out, Rob, in your report, so it's a preview without reading your report, but I'm very sure that it's in there. The first is that we do need to, the first thing is there's no point talking about finance unless you talk about investment and you talk about quality of investment and the scale of that investment. So country-led investment frameworks that are purpose-driven in the way that Harry talked about, the way Ivan talked about, is absolutely central. It will vary from country to country, but country platforms are a short form for saying we need programmatic, strategic, country-led investment. There's a big opportunity this year to make a big push on country-led platforms. It's coming from multiple quarters. It's coming from the G20, it's coming from the COP, it's coming from NDC partnerships, it's coming from the GCF, it's coming from the MDBs, but most of all, it has to come from the countries. So we have to say that how can we excite countries that you have to take the lead? I had the privilege, Chantal, to be at the PCC meeting, the Presidential Climate Commission meeting last week. And, it is truly impressive how South Africa has put together not a whole of economy, a whole of society approach. I mean, it's uniquely South African, but, it's really impressive as an outsider to see how a country is able to bring its constituents together around some kind of purpose. It's challenging. It's got lots of, and, it went through difficult times, but I think, my sense of having followed it now for some time, it's back to good times. So it's okay. It's good to see progress. Brazil is another example, but it's coming. So that's one, I think. Second, we have to be able to deal with debt and fiscal space, because that is a real constraint on many, many countries, and we have to find solutions. I won't go into the detail, but there was a Jubilee gathering last week in the Vatican around the debt issue. And there is a real sense now that this is the time and this is the year to make a breakthrough. So we will get a lot of focus in Sevilla. We need to take it through to the end of the year and say, okay, enough of the talking, what are the solutions in debt and fiscal space? I do think that domestic resource mobilization, even though it's not part of the 1.3 trillion, to put it in, to compare the 1.3 trillion in our numbers, domestic resource mobilization is 1.9 trillion. So yes, it is indeed dominant. And it is about 1.2 trillion of that is public, about 600 to 700 private. And the private part and the role of national development banks and indeed of capital markets is going to be absolutely crucial. But I also want to say that we've been going backwards on domestic resource mobilization in the developing world. So it's not a question of saying, oh, we have to do so much more. Because of all the stresses, this is an area of extreme urgency. On the external side, on the private capital, just to emphasize what we have to do, of the 1.3 trillion, roughly half is private, external private. And indeed it should be, because that's where the large pool of savings are. The hundreds of trillions are in that bucket. How much of that are we actually getting into climate investment in emerging markets and developing countries other than China? Only about 30 billion. So that's the biggest hill to climb. And a lot of the work that will have, and London Climate Week, there's going to be a lot of events focused on this, but we need a roadmap for the private sector. I mean, we need a roadmap for everybody, but we particularly need a roadmap for the private sector. This is, again, the year to say what are the breakthroughs we need. Multilateral development banks and development finance institutions like BII have a crucial role to play. And I would argue that there are, the asks for these institutions from me would be, they have to become much, much more proactive agents of scaling up the investment agenda. They can't say we are doing our own thing. Their KPIs must be measured by those investment objectives that I was talking about. And, saying, are we individually and collectively really doing enough? Not all about money. It's as much about the kind of catalytic market creation solutions and all that. But their KPIs have to own this in a much, much more proactive way. And I think it's fair to say that the MDBs were behind the curve, for example, on country platforms. They came in late. They came in uneven ways, some MDBs more than others. But if we are going to scale up effectively, work as a system, MDBs really have to embrace that. Second, we have to find innovative ways for them to really get the private sector piece going. And that means, as you heard from Harry, much, much more than the kind of solutions they had before. There's a lot they can do. I mean, Avinash Prasad, whom, and we've been discussing this idea of securitization as an approach so that you can turn over not just your own finance, but, get banks out of the business, get capital markets to come in much faster. Warehousing is one approach to it. Lots you can do there. The whole de-risking in an end-to-end model needs to be developed. A lot of very good things have been happening to the World Bank Private Sector Lab, but still at a relatively low level. So second big ticket item is this catalytic role on private finance. And the third is, where are the MDBs going to get their capital from? So we all know that there are these, capital adequacy framework reforms. So if you ask, if you are asked an informed group and you said, how much more can you do? The answer will come back, maybe between 40 to 50%. But everybody will say 40 to 50%. Nobody is saying zero. And so there's some scope for firepower there. Interestingly, a lot of MDBs have a lot of undispersed balances in their books. A lot of undispersed balances that can be used quite effectively. Third thing, we will need resources for them that can help them make these predictable scaled commitments. Where will that come from? It is not going to come from capital increases easily. So as was mentioned, guarantees are extremely powerful, but the other is hybrid capital. If a sovereign wealth fund puts money into the World Bank or Asian Development Bank or Inter-American Development Bank, it earns the same rate of return as it would if it were holding a US security, in fact, a better rated security, and it enables the institutions to leverage that 6 to 10 times. In a world where we do not have much options, we have to pursue these innovative options extremely, diligently. The last thing I'll leave is, I just want to put the ODA part and the bilateral part a little bit in perspective. So of the current financing of, roughly about 122 excluding, if you take the NCQG, which is the 300 billion target of official commitments made for 2035. The current, if you count it like for like today, that number is about 170 billion. Okay, that also tells you how ambitious the NCQG is. So it's of that 170 billion, the bilateral climate finance is about 40 billion. Okay. it will be very, very difficult to hold it at that level. When Carbis Bay, our hope was we would maybe increase it by 60 in 26, but now that will be a big challenge. So getting the most out of that is number one priority, as Diana was saying. I think that's the effectiveness of that finance comes into big play. But it's not going to be a solution to the 1.3 trillion. And we will be wasting time if we keep hammering, the 1.3 trillion and the 40 billion, look at the gap. What is necessary, though, is for developed and developing countries to recognize that we will need innovative finance of different kinds to fill the gap. So what are those? There's the SDR. I do think there's still quite a lot of firepower in SDRs. It doesn't require a lot of, it requires the central banks to become a little bit more development oriented. But, we can get a lot of firepower out of that. Carbon markets, I think, have potential. They'll still take a little bit of time, but there is, in a transition period, carbon markets can be quite powerful. And third, solidarity levies. So we have the IMO. We still need to finalize it. But one that I think has great potential is airline, based fees, whether it's for jet fuel. The whole idea here is there are some sectors, including fossil fuel production, airlines, shipping, where the polluter is not paying right now. And so why not get the polluter to pay, but at the same time generate predictable revenues? So in each of these areas, the way to kind of motivate this, and I also, let me end with two quick other points I should flag. One is the role of private philanthropy. So private philanthropy right now is about 10 billion. They have potential to go up, but they're also not as effective as it could be. There's a scope for much more effectiveness of private philanthropy by saying these are the areas where we can add most value. They have done, for example, great support in the case of country platforms, just energy transition and the like. Second, the biggest potential area of growth is South-South cooperation. So Diana referred to it as expanding the contributor base. I mean, in a semantic way, I prefer South-South cooperation because it's a more positive connotation. But I have absolutely no doubt that by 2035, South-South cooperation will be much more important than North-South flows. So that's a good thing. It's something we should celebrate, not something we should say, oh, this is about a tax. So in each of these areas, what I really would urge us to do is go back to Ivan's challenge. And so in the work that we are doing, we are saying, what's the vision? What's the goalpost that we should have for 2035? What's the strategy for getting there? What are priorities for action? And what could be concrete deliverables by COP30 that can create a virtuous cycle of action? So each of us in our respective areas can contribute to that. And we have, we have in Brazil real leadership on this. We are very fortunate that they are leading this in that direction. And this event and London Climate Week, I think, can be really, really helpful in giving it the impetus. The timing could not be better. Thank you, Amal-Lee.
Thank you. Well, I think clearly there's a lot more we all want to talk about. So I'd like to invite you to continue the discussion through into the lobby area where we're serving some drinks. Conscious that we are over time, so thank you very, very much for joining us. But also want to really thank all our speakers, our panelists. I'm sure we could have spoken for a lot longer. Amar, thank you as always for those very insightful closing remarks. And also for everyone who helped really organise this event in quite last minute, quite short notice. And particularly thank you to Rob and the team as well. And Mamuna as well. Yes, over there. Thank you. So yeah, please join us.